Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. I'm going to jump right into this topic today, and let me let you know that you might think that it's a misspelling, that I have Pharaohs twice, because the topic is Pharaohs, Mummies, and Kings. And the reason why it's Pharaohs twice is because it is spelled both ways. It's spelled Pharoah, and then it's also spelled Pharaoh. So just so we're clear. And this could really be a consciousness raising for some people in particular, because we have spent our whole lives being dealt with contradictory information that is detrimental to us as Black people. I'm going to start out with the mummies. Let's talk about mummies. I'm talking about real mummies. A mummy is a deceased human being whose skin and organs have been preserved either by intentional or accidental exposure to chemicals, extreme cold, very low humidity, or lack of air, so that the body does not decay further if it's kept in cool and dry conditions. The English word mummy, M-U-M-M-Y, is derived from medieval Latin, the word mumia, a borrowing of the medieval Arabic word mumia, and from a Persian word mum, which means wax, which meant an embalmed corpse. Now, some people may recognize the word mumia, what they say is a medieval Latin word, M-U-M-I-A, and recognize a similar word, which is a name of a brother by the name Mumia Abu Jamal. But his is an African word, not a medieval Latin word. But let's understand that term mummy. First of all, it's not just Egyptians. That's what most people think of as mummies. are Egyptian because we've seen over the years different ones. Um, but it's a very, very fine art and science. Let me give you an example, and you may not have ever seen this or heard this before. I'm going to tell you how the process works. First of all, the mummification process takes 70 days. That's 70. 70 days. Ain't that something? Special priests worked as embalmers, treating and wrapping the body. Um, Now, besides knowing, the rituals and prayers to be performed at various stages, the priest also needed a detailed knowledge of human anatomy. Now, I'm using the word priest because that's the word that's used in a lot of the literature, but that I'm using that term loosely. They may not have been called priests by the Africans who did this. They definitely were scientists. Okay, so now the first step in the process was the removal of all internal parts that might decay rapidly. The brain was removed by carefully inserting special hooked instruments up through the nostrils in order to pull out bits of brain tissue. It was a delicate operation and one that could easily disfigure the face. Think about it. I mean, it might be kind of gruesome to think about. They pulling your brain out through your nose. But think about how intricate that is. You see, we're not talking about some paint, some haphazard stuff here. And we're talking about thousands of years ago, okay? Then the embalmers removed the organs of the abdomen and chest through a cut usually made on the left side of the abdomen. They left only the heart in place, believing it to be the center of a person's being and intelligence. That's key here, right? They didn't take the heart, they left the heart in the body. Wow. See, these are things they never talk about when they talk about mummies and all of that and the science of it. You never hear about the science of it. But that wasn't no accident. They didn't accidentally leave the heart, they left the heart there on purpose. The other organs were preserved separately, with the stomach, liver, lungs, and intestines placed in special jars called canopic jars. Now, in this graphic we're looking at, those little jars on the side down there on the bottom, those are canopic jars. That's where other parts of the body that they took out and put them in there. And they were buried with the mummy. And then later, the organs were treated, wrapped, and replaced inside of the bodies. Now, here's where it gets even deeper. The embalmers next removed all moisture from the body. They did this by covering the body with natron, a type of salt which has great drying properties, and by placing additional natron packets inside the body. Think about this. We're talking about a few thousand years ago. They had this much knowledge of how to do this. That's amazing. When the body had dried out completely, embalmers removed the internal packets and lightly washed the natron off the body. The result was a very dried out but recognizable human form. To make the mummy seem even more lifelike, sunken areas of the body were filled out with linen and other materials, and false eyes were added. Now, I had to include this because this is a mummy and it's in the Vatican. It's in the Vatican. Look closely at this mummy. Now, you think about it. You never think about a mummy being in the Vatican. This is a mummy that was taken from Africa. You'd probably say Egypt, but Egypt's in Africa. And as far as I can tell, that looks like some black hands and some black feet. Don't it to you? And it might be possible that it darkened because of the process, but I doubt it. Um, but I had to ask myself, why do they have a mummy in the Vatican? And I bet it's not in the part where the tourists go. Now, next, after they did all of that, next the wrapping began. Each mummy needed hundreds of yards of linen. The priest carefully wound the long strips of ribbon around the body, sometimes even wrapping each finger and toe separately before wrapping the entire hand and foot. And in order to protect the dead from mishap, amulets were placed among the wrappings and prayers and magical words written on some of the linen strips. And often the priest placed a mask of the person's face between the layers of head bandages. And at several stages, the body was coated with warm resin and the wrappings resumed once again. And finally, they wrapped the final cloth or shroud in place and secured it with linen strips. The mummy was complete. Is that deep? Yeah, now you know that it wasn't some quick and dirty process. And in order to do this, that meant that a lot of care was taken. This wasn't just some slapdash process. Now, some people want to know why preserve the body? Well, the Egyptians or the Africans, because it took place in more than just Egypt, but basically the Egyptians believed that the mummified body was the home for the soul or spirit. If the body was destroyed, the spirit might be lost. The idea of spirit really involved three spirits: the Ka, the Ba, and Ak. The Ka, which is a double of the person, would remain in the tomb and need the offerings and the objects that they put in the tomb with them. The Ba, or the soul, was free to fly out of the tomb and fly around and then come back to it. And it was the Ak, AKH, perhaps translated as spirit, which had to travel through the underworld to the final judgment and entrance to the afterlife. To the Egyptians, all three were essential. Okay? Now, who got mummified? Well, the Pharaohs, of course, got mummified, and they were buried in very elaborate tombs. But also, members of nobility and officials often were mummified, and occasionally, folks who were neither, if they were, quote, common people, but they could afford it, they did it as well. Okay? Let's take a look at now some of these mummies we're very familiar with. This is actually King Tut when they first opened his uh, sarcophagus. This is 1922. The white guy, I think his name was Carter. He's credited with supposedly discovering King Tut's tomb. And This is what it looked like when they first opened it. Okay. And now, of course, they've cleaned it up and it goes around the world on tour. You know how they are. They take our stuff and just own that. This is what many people are, uh, what they're used to seeing, King Tut. Um, Interestingly enough, um, where are we at here? Look at his hands. And on some of the others, you could see it where they were crossed over. And does that remind you of the way the hands are, arms are crossed in the movie Black Panther? Yeah, that's where they got it from. Now, those are real mummies. Those are some real mummies. All right? But we grew up with, and still do, have a whole different concept of mummies, and we don't relate them to the real mummies. And that's because of the movies. You see, going back to the 1920s, there have been these mummy movies that have given a good portion of the world a distorted and incorrect view of mummies. I believe one of the first ones was a fictional character called Kharis, Kharis, and he popped up in the Universal Studios Mummy series um, in the 1940s. Now, the original movie, The Mummy, was 1932, and it starred Boris Karloff. But his mummy character's name was Imhotep. Ain't that something? Imhotep. Okay? And that's because there was supposedly a white, huge white interest in Egyptian archaeology during that time. So they created this character and had the nerve to call him Imhotep and have Boris Karloff acting as the mummy. The first of the other series of Kharis was The Mummy's Hand in 1940. And then there were three subsequent films: The Mummy's Tomb, The Mummy's Ghost, and The Mummy's Curse. That was 1940, 42, and two in 1944. Um, Now, I believe it's The Mummy's Curse in 1944 that starred Lon Chaney Jr. And yeah, now we probably have the image of the this foot dragging mummy, right? That wasn't Boris Karloff though. That was this guy, a Western actor named Tom Tyler, and Lon Chaney Jr. Yeah. Now, see, in most people's minds, there's no relationship between these mummies and real mummies. See, we don't think of King Tut like we think of the mummies in the movies, do we? And that's important because of something else. One of the things about the mummies in the movie is that a few of them, it's been over 20, something like over 20 mummy movies. Um, One of the things that would seem to be a recurring theme was that this character, Karis, he always would be searching for his queen or somebody who looked like his queen. And why that's so sneaky is this: if we understand that the real mummies were, and this guy was, they also talked about him being pharaohs, right? Then the women that they all seem to be always after in these movies were always white women. So the underlying thing is that if the mummies were pharaohs and the pharaohs were black, then you got a black man trying to find his white woman queen. But it's unspoken because it wasn't assumed or thought of that the mummy was a pharaoh, a black man. Okay? See that graphic there? They got pharaohs right there. Pharaohs. Yeah, that's in the French. And the storyline was simply this: Karis was considered a priest who was in love with this woman, a princess named Ananka. And he was always trying to bring her back to life in the original story back then. And so he would be trying to get her body and read from what were called the scrolls of life. Now this is fiction. And he almost succeeded, but he got caught, and he's sentenced to be buried alive and watch over the princess for eternity. You see how they take the stories and they twist them up? It's important that we understand that because it's both conscious and unconscious. And we're talking about pharaohs who go back over 3,000 years. Now let's look at some real pharaohs. See, this is where, we've gone through the mummies, and I think it's pretty clear that the mummies were pharaohs. Most of them were pharaohs. So who are the pharaohs? Well, the pharaoh, in reality, he was a civil and religious administrator. He or she, and they did have some women, they enacted the laws, they collected taxes, and they defended Egypt from invaders as commander in chief of the army. But here's one of the important things: they were responsible for maintaining Ma'at, or the cosmic order, balance, and justice. And that included going to war when necessary. Now, just for a second, let me go over here and show you the 42 divine principles of Ma'at. Why this is important to understand. The 42 divine principles of Ma'at. And you can look them up yourself and or come back to this at another time. But understand, this is 42 divine principles for cosmic order, balance, and justice. Why is that important? Because some believe, and I'm one of them, believe this is where they later came up with the Ten Commandments. They couldn't do all 42 because but the pharaohs, and here you get to see some of the um, pharaohs, and there's no question that they were black. That's Hashem right there. Um, and some of them you can see where they intentionally cut off the noses. Yeah, we've seen that over and over again. So I want you to see these real pharaohs. Okay, that's Abu Siddel. Sabel. And I'm going to show you another shot of it because Abu Sabel, the huge temple, and you definitely can tell that these are black folks. And they are pharaohs. They're pharaohs. There it is there. Okay? Several thousand years old. Yeah, that's bad. So, in understanding who the pharaohs really were, there was another area, and this is where uh, Clyde is an authority. For those who know who Clyde is, he's an authority on this because this is another area where the pharaohs and the mummies get sidetracked for people because of the distortions of the Christian religion. You see, when you look in the Bible, the King James Version, and the movies that were made for that, what do you see? You see white pharaohs. This is your Brenner, Ten Commandments. Okay? And in many different books and artworks, you see the same thing. Yeah, look at that. Look at that. Okay? And the sad thing is that there are many people who think this is the truth. You know? Now you've seen in other graphics that I showed you earlier where they got that stuff from. Where they got it from. They just stole it and put it in the movies and act like it was theirs. But also in the Bible, the King James Version, let's see, it's something that happens, and again, Clyde is an authority on this, but this is from First Kings, I believe it's First Kings, verse 9, or chapter 9. And it says, and Solomon became allied to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, by marriage, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had made an end of building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall of Jerusalem round about. Now, I mention that because, of course, we know Solomon was black, right? Um, but here's the curious thing: in these verses, in the King James version of the Bible, here's another one. This is Second Kings, and in this one, look, it says, and when he heard say of Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia, behold, he is come out to fight against thee. He sent messengers again unto Hezekiah, saying, thus shall ye speak to Hezekiah, king of Judah, saying, let not thy God in whom you trusted beguile thee, saying, Jerusalem shall not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Behold, thou hast heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands by destroying them utterly, and shalt thou be delivered. Now, what's interesting in both of those passages and many others in the King James Version of the Bible is that they didn't name the Pharaohs. You see? They don't name the Pharaohs. And so that leaves it up to speculation for some people who don't know any better. Let me go back to the first king. See? It says it right there. It says, and Solomon became allied to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, by marriage, and took Pharaoh's daughter. It doesn't name him. That's why, for some people, when the Europeans just took them and made them white, um, that was done on purpose to confuse black people. Because some black folks think that the pharaohs were white. In fact, Isn't it true? A lot of them think that they go along with the mythology that uh, the Jews were held in bondage by the evil Pharaoh, right? And you got that song, Let My People Go. When Israel was in Egypt's land. Think about that. When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go. Go through the whole song and dissect it and see what's in there, because that's what's in our minds. That's what's in our minds. And so here you have pharaohs, pharaohs, mummies, and kings, all mixed up in people's heads, and they don't separate them. So they don't realize who the mummies are, who the pharaohs are, and who the kings are. They all are us. They're all us. Haven't they done a magnificent job of confusing us? Yeah. So I'm going to leave it here pretty much because I've said what I wanted to say and the evidence is here. And hopefully it will allow you to decompartmentalize how in your head you had the mummies over here and the mummies from the movies over there and the pharaohs over there, and none the twain shall meet. But now we understand that was done on purpose. Look at those body snatchers. Mm, mm, mm. Anyway, I would say as always, thank you, of course, and be sure to, if you like, share this. But as I close, I say, no justice, no peace, no love, KNOW.